We are live, Elizabeth.
Good evening, comrades and friends on our YouTube channel. Welcome back to another Socialist Action webcast. We are glad you are spending the next 90 minutes with us, and we want you to participate by putting your questions to the panelists in the chat column. My name is Elizabeth Weiss, a leading member of Socialist Action and your host for the show, along with our technical producer, Daniel Teray. If you are not a member of the SA YouTube channel, please sign up tonight. It's free to do so. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people in a place called Toronto. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is Choice is Under Attack. Women Resist from Texas to Toronto to New Brunswick, with speakers Lisa Luinenberg in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Rubina Chowdhury in Toronto, Joyce Arthur in Vancouver, and Robbie Mahood in Montreal. Lisa, Rubina, Joyce, and Robbie will each speak for about 10 minutes. After that, we will take questions written into the chat column from the online audience. So let's begin. Lisa is a feminist and migrant workers' rights activist based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She is a writer, organizer, and member of the political committee of Socialist Action USA. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here tonight. I have a presentation to share with you guys, so I'm just going to share my screen here a moment. All right. So, thanks again for having me here tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Texas abortion ban tonight. And some of the protests that happened across the U.S. Last weekend. So I'm going to start with just a little bit about myself. I'm a mother of two. I'm a member of the Socialist Action National Committee and co-founder of the SA Women's Liberation Group. So if you want to be part of that, reach out to me. I wanted to share a little bit this flyer that we created, the Women's Liberation. We created this flyer to pass out at the march, the national marches that happened last weekend, October 2nd. It was a national day of action called for by Women's March, but sponsored by over 200 organizations. And there were over 650 marches that took place across the US on that day. So this really shows the breadth and the depth of the abortion issue, which touches women everywhere. So hundreds of thousands came out to march, but it wasn't nearly the same size as Trump's inauguration in 2017, when there were 4 million women and allies marching in the streets. Women's March is Democratic Party funded, and this may have lowered some of the turnout. Maybe some people are getting sucked into some of the promises made by the Biden administration, but there are also a lot of smaller grassroots women organizations who are also involved in organizing these demonstrations. The Women's March did not control the messaging at a lot of the demonstrations. So it was a really significant event overall. And there were a lot of women who showed up who were really pissed. So I'm going to share some pictures from some of the marches. I have quite a few pictures I took at the march in Minneapolis. It was a rainy day, but there were somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 people total. We started at the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden and marched across the freeway to a park on the other side. The crowd was largely white women, although there was some diversity there as well. And I saw everyone from a baby in a stroller to an elderly woman using a walker who was probably in her 80s. So there's a huge range of ages there. And then it was followed by a rally with about 10 speakers. It was a very lively crowd, many creative signs and chants. There was a small group of pro-lifers that showed up, but they were easily drowned out by the shouts of the crowd, pro-choice. Just a few more pictures from Minneapolis. And just a few more showing some of the signs at the march from the crowd. I'm going to highlight a little bit of some of the other demonstrations that happened around the country. So these are a couple pictures from Portland, Oregon. There were about 1,000 people who marched there. They went on a walk to the Capitol, and then there was like a reproductive rights slam open mic at the end. So a major theme there was linking the importance of abortion access to sexuality and gender rights, and including the rights of trans people in reproductive care. In San Francisco, there were about 5,000 people who marched, including white women, Blacks, Latinos, all ages, and there were a lot of spirited chanting there. Here we have some pictures from San Jose in California. There were thousands of people who turned out there. In Chicago, there were about 7,000 people who turned out to march, and it was just one of 21 events that were held in the state of Illinois that day. And again, a lot of diversity in the crowd and just kind of a furious mood. There was also a contingent from the Chicago Teachers Union there. In Texas, Houston, Texas, which is the heart of the fight against the abortion ban, there were 10,000 in the crowd to protest the assault on reproductive rights. Washington, D.C. was the main national demonstration. There were also about 10,000 people marching there. They went up over by the Supreme Court, which is an important target. There were thousands in Austin, Texas, and then just a few other significant demonstrations that took place was 7,000 in Los Angeles. Phoenix and Denver both had 5,000, 3,000 in New York City, 1,500 in Albany, New York, and Seattle, about 1,000 people. So those are just some of the bigger ones. And they were, like I said, there were lots of smaller marches scattered around the country. And SA was there interacting, supporting, marching, passing out flyers. All right, so let's see. So I want to talk a little bit about the history. How did we get here? Why are women still marching today when this has been an issue since the 70s? U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked what can be done about the large number of states restricting abortion rights. She responded, "We need a movement like the one that existed when abortion was illegal." That movement included 50,000 women marching down Fifth Avenue in the August 26, 1970 Women's Strike for Equality. There were mass mobilizations around the country in the streets chanting free abortion on demand. This was a grassroots movement demanding equality and an end to the oppression of women. This is why a conservative, all-male U.S. Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade in 1973. Since this time, there have been ongoing attacks against a woman's right to choose. Access to free, safe, and legal abortions has eroded over the decades. And I just thought this picture of the sign that I saw in Minneapolis was a great demonstration of that. I'm tired of holding this sign since the 1970s. That's what women are dealing with, but we continue to struggle. So, have Democrats protected abortion rights for women? The answer to that would be no. In over 40 years, the Democrats have done nothing to protect abortion rights. Basically, they never codified the Roe v. Wade decision into federal law. And for over 40 years, they've continued to reauthorize the Hyde Amendment, which bars the use of federal funds to pay for abortions. So this means that Medicaid recipients, so those are people who are struggling financially and get basically insurance through the government, they cannot choose abortion. This is not allowed. In 2010, President Obama signed an executive order that expanded the Hyde Amendment to add it to the Affordable Care Act. There has been some attempt during this march to control some of the messaging. as well. Like the Women's March sent out an email to everyone saying that, for example, they didn't want anyone to bring coat hangers to the abortion rights march because it might be too controversial or triggering for some people. But I definitely saw plenty of coat hangers in Minneapolis at the march. So their attempts to control those kinds of messages that go out are not always successful. Women, we have our own minds and we speak them. So I want to go over a little bit about what is the Texas abortion ban. It went into effect September 1st and basically prohibits any abortions after 6 weeks when a fetal heartbeat is first detectable. I think it's the name of it is like the Texas Heartbeat Act. Most women don't even know they're pregnant at this time. And this is the first time that a 6-week ban has ever been allowed to go into effect. So it's the most restrictive abortion law in the US. And just for comparison, Roe v. Wade allows abortions up to the point of viability, which is usually around 22 to 24 weeks. So that's a huge restriction. There are no exceptions for rape or incest, only for so-called medical emergencies. But a lot of providers are struggling with what does that mean? What constitutes a medical emergency? This is also a novel legal strategy, which was designed to make it more difficult to prevent the law from being enforced, basically, because they're allowing anyone, any individual to sue a woman getting an abortion or someone who aids a woman in getting abortion. So that could be like a friend, a family member, an Uber driver who gives that woman a ride. It could be a receptionist at the clinic. It could be an abortion provider. It could be the woman herself. They can be sued for up to $10,000 by any individual. Those suing are entitled to have their court fees paid, but those being sued cannot recover court fees even if they win. So this is really like a vigilante style legislation, and it's already inspiring copycats in other states. There's also restrictions on getting abortion pills prescribed online or through the mail. So how is this impacting women? Well, basically, this new law could bar 85 to 90% of women in Texas from accessing abortions. The biggest impacts are on poor women, teens, women of color, and women living in rural areas. And I had a quote that I pulled from an article that just said they're trying to figure out paying for airfare or gas or a train ticket that may need hotels and meals. They have to figure out time off of work, how to figure out childcare, and this can be a real struggle. And that's just for women who are able to go out of state to obtain an abortion. A lot of women don't even have the ability to do that. It's also impacting healthcare providers because it's making them more difficult to advise women in situations where they would typically advise the woman to terminate a pregnancy, but it's not necessarily threatening a woman's life. So, for example, if a woman comes in and she's experiencing a miscarriage and her water's broken, well, that could be, it's a non-viable pregnancy. Maybe she's 17 weeks along. She's at risk for having an infection. She could get sepsis. That could be life-threatening. But then it's very unclear to a lot of the providers of what is a medical emergency. Is this a situation where I can still give a woman, advise a woman to have an abortion and I'm protected? It's really calling a lot of that into question, the typical care that abortion providers would give to women. It's also impacting local clinics in Texas, and then clinics that are out of state are being inundated with patients coming from Texas trying to get abortions in other states. So just for example, Planned Parenthood said in Oklahoma, providers have seen a 133% increase in patients from Texas, and providers in New Mexico have seen a 67% jumps in patients. And then just in Texas, I think there was a court filing that said that so far, like 56% of women have been turned away because of finding a fetal heartbeat. So what's next? Well, initially the Supreme Court refused to block the law from going into effect. So this was they handled it in kind of a strange way. There was no full briefing or arguments before any court when this happened. They only issued a 1-paragraph unsigned court order, basically taking no action and allowing the law to go.
1 minute.
So scholars are worried about, this is kind of like a new trend with the Supreme Court, that they've been seeing more of this, just, making decisions without much argument or explanation on these really important cases. So just as of yesterday, a federal judge has blocked the ban from being enforced, basically saying that people in the court, they can't enforce the ban. But this is already being challenged, so it's going to go to the appeals court, the U.S. appeals court. So it is a victory, but also it was written into the law that if, for example, the law is blocked but later reversed, and abortion clinics provide abortions during that time the law was blocked, but it was reversed later, they could still be held liable for that later. So the Supreme Court is also going to reconvene starting this week, and they're going to hear several cases on abortion, including a Mississippi law that bans abortions after 15 weeks. And the Supreme Court right now is mostly conservative. So what can you do about it? What can I do about it? Well, I think the takeaway here is that we can't rely on the Supreme Court or the Democratic Party to make decisions about women's healthcare and women's bodies. We need an independent movement of women and allies that are in the streets. That's how Roe v. Wade was won, and that's how we're going to win this fight again. So, and that I would really emphasize that, if you are able, join a local women's organization in your area, fight for independent leadership, fight for that organization to be separated from the Democratic Party and make decisions on its own, and really fight for an inclusive movement that trans women are also included in the movement is very important. And join Socialist Action. I put our website up here, Socialist Action Canada or Socialist Action USA. And then we also have a women's liberation group. So we're a group of women. You don't have to be an SA to join, but we're meeting once a month to discuss these issues and what we can do about them and read books together. So if you're interested, please send us an email to the email on the screen. And then just get out in the streets, get out in the streets, protest, demonstrate in solidarity with the women's movement. And if you can't do that, support online. There's lots of ways you can get involved online. So I'll end it there. And thank you so much for having me again.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Our next panelist is Rubina Chowdhury, and she works as a social worker at a rape crisis center in Toronto and participates in the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. She's a member of Socialist Action Canada. Welcome, Rubina.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone. I'm Rubina Chowdhury. I'm a rape crisis counselor at Toronto Rape Crisis Center. So, and a mother of 2 wonderful daughters, just vital like me. And today I'm focusing on pregnancy from rape. That's the work I do. So TRCC, I'm introducing TRCC and also few organizations. They work for abortion in, not directly, but indirectly with and for abortion. So TRCC has 2 hashtags that we follow. We believe survivors, one, and other one is our body is our business. In TRCC, we are providing various services for sexual assault and rape survivors. Our services are planned to work on PTSD through active listening on crisis line and face-to-face one-on-one counseling. Survivors carry trauma and stresses with them for a long period, often lifetime. So we have different caucus too, like queer caucus, Black youth caucus, Black caucus, Indigenous caucus, South Asian Youth Caucus, Vietnamese Caucus, Spanish speaking caucus, and they are all, most of them are survivors, and we work with them in a group or workshop. So our most busy service in crisis line, which one runs for 24/7 by hundreds of trained volunteers. According to this fiscal year, we received altogether 3,650 calls. Almost every year, we have similar number of calls. Last year, it was higher than before because of COVID-19. We do not get called specifically for abortion directly because of the excess of all abortion clinics and sexual health services in Ontario. We cannot deny the facilities like provincial health insurance coverage, healthcare, and free of cost counseling services in Ontario. So TRCC do not refer to our abortion clinic directly either. We refer to pre-abortion counseling. There are few nonprofit organizations like Women's Health in Women's Hand for abortion consultancy and referrals, Immigrant Women's Health Center for intersectionality service. This agency also provides consultancy and make referrals. Hassle-free clinic at Church Street and Zurich Street East, they provide post-abortion checkup. So there are all no health insurance required places. It is important that these facilities do not ask for health insurance or any kind to ensure that these services are accessible to everyone, including women with homelessness. OHIP and UHIP both cover surgical abortion in Canada, but many women, especially in Ontario, but many women do not have access of provincial health care. That's unfortunate, really unfortunate. So the consequences for the recent law change in Texas, I'm covering in little. The Dulles Rape Crisis Line, they are also open like TRCC 24/7. They informed that they used to provide the same service of survivors and recent victims, also used to make referrals to doctors to terminate their unwanted pregnancies. Now, country's most surgical abortion ban law, SB 8, went into an effect in Texas. All rape crisis centers across the state are immediately forced to limit their support to all survivors. Dulles Rape Crisis Center informed that before September 1st, it was different. When a survivor asked for referrals and they referred them to healthcare provider. Now that access is attacked in Texas by their Supreme Court. So when we focus on Toronto, it is way different than Dulles because of different abortion law. TRCC do not refer survivors directly to healthcare providers or for two facilities in Ontario. Especially, we must remember Dr. Henry Morgentaler and many activists that fought for abortion rights under universal healthcare. TRCC refers to health counseling first, though one important part I want to inform to you all, that counseling part. In Morgentaler Clinic in Toronto, counseling after abortion is for 20 minutes. In Choice and Health Clinic in Toronto provides 30 minutes counseling. So counseling before and after procedure is as important as the surgery for women's well-being, especially to minimize their trauma and distress. So these facilities make huge difference in Canada. The accessibility in reproductive health care in Canada is a vital reason why pregnancy from rape is much lower than US. In USA, 1 to 5% rapes will end in pregnancy, whereas only 1% of rape results in pregnancy in Canada. One of these positive causes in Canada could be the immediate health care women received just after the unpleasant incident occurred in their life. So for instance, Emergency contraception is readily available in number of services across the country. I think USA have the same facilities. We are respectful and blessed with our services we got. But on the other hand, we need more in Canada. There are shortage of health service provider for surgical abortion, including physicians and nurses. General physicians are not trained to go surgical abortion in medical school. Neither are all gynecologists are trained on abortion, or they providing the support when women in need, because still our surroundings, our society have stigma on abortion and still less respect for women's choices on their own body and life. Police questioning is another issue for us. Police questioning system needs to be improved. They should get better training to respect women and non-judgmental after getting raped. That will bring a big change in Canada if we can mend that police system. So I'm introducing another agency and organization actually, that Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rape. In Ontario, there is another organization, it calls Action Canada, is doing a wonderful job on abortion. Their slogan is, "Commit to resist abortion rights for all." We have limited access for surgical abortion. Even in Ontario, they have a toll-free number, that 1-888-642-2725. This organization works and supports globally, and they provide support for surgical abortion across Canada, including remote areas. They work with 64 abortion clinics across Canada for surgical abortion and medical abortion. Among them, only 5 are in Toronto. Most of the small cities and remote areas do not have surgical abortion facilities in Ontario. In that case, women need to commute in big cities like Toronto, Ottawa, Hamilton, London, Mississauga, just like big cities. Also work to sustain and grow the government of Canada's global leadership on sexual and reproductive health and rights through its development assistance and foreign policy. So let's come to the point of New Brunswick. The ban of surgical abortion in clinic in New Brunswick is a threat on abortion right in Canada, also for the province's rape crisis services like Texas. The only clinic that offers surgical abortion past 6 weeks in the province was forced to close. This Fredericton-based clinic was also the only medical center that offered adequate health care to trans people in the province. This summer, the federal government, Trudeau government, withheld healthcare transfers to New Brunswick over its failure to live up to its obligations under the Canada Health Act. We must continue to work to protect abortion rights across Canada from ongoing threats. At the end, we are not only threatened by the political parties, but also anti-abortion organizations that are gaining support in our society. One of them is Pregnancy Care Clinic. They spend a vast sum of money to work for anti-abortion. Many people have been attracted by their advertisement on TTC. If you see, that's a really nice advertisement they have on TTC, and they have been misleading them against abortion. That's why many women do not want abortion for pregnancy from rape. They want to keep that baby. Anti-abortion may result for infanticide, as many mothers kill their unwanted infant when they became unwanted pregnant from rape. So women's bodies are not a birth machine. Women have full right to say no to unwanted touch, no to unwanted pregnancy, as well as no to unwanted male-controlled legal policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Rubina. Our next panelist is Joyce Arthur. She is the Executive Director of the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, known as ARCC, a national group that protects the legal right to abortion and works to improve access. Before founding ARCC in 2005, she ran the Pro-Choice Network in British Columbia for 10 years and was the editor of the national newsletter Pro-Choice Press. Joyce is a writer, media spokesperson, and speaker on abortion and other women's rights and social justice issues. Welcome, Joyce.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm talking to you from Vancouver and from the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And we still have some sun shining out here, so that's nice. Now I have a little PowerPoint that I'll share with you, so I'll just share my screen and hopefully this will work. We did test it. Can you see it?
Yes.
Great. So I'm with the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, the Executive Director, and we've been around for 16 years. We're a grassroots advocacy group. We do a lot of political work because we're not a charity, so lobbying politicians, making sure our legal rights are safe. So in Canada, I'll talk about this a bit later, but it is a bit different from the US. Our legal rights are safe, like for now in the current situation. The real problem we have here in Canada is with access. I call it the rural-urban divide, where access can be like excellent in some of the major cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. But as soon as you go outside that those areas, it just plummets. And a lot of people have to travel. There's only a few access points in most provinces outside of BC, Ontario, and Quebec, which have the best access. There's a lack of providers, especially outside major cities. I've heard sometimes there's almost too many providers in a few cities sometimes. As Rubina alluded to, there's a lack of full funding in New Brunswick and Ontario. There's one clinic in New Brunswick that the provincial government refuses to fund in violation of the Canada Health Act. And Ontario as well, there's a few clinics or doctor's offices that have to charge a few fees, not the full cost, but some fees to people accessing abortion. And people have to travel a lot. I'll show you that in the next slide. Now, the pandemic did constrict access, especially at the beginning. It was tough. People couldn't travel. And, you know, that really limited access. But we do have the abortion pill called mifegammiso. And so telemedicine has taken a big step up during the pandemic. And here in BC, I think in other provinces as well, a woman can just get on the phone with a Skype call with a provider and get it prescribed for her. And then she can go to her local pharmacy and get it filled. But there's also a lack of political will to really address access problems. And even though, you know, we have a pro-choice liberal government, I find them a little bit slow in doing things. So here's the map I mentioned. It shows you, it's a heat map. It shows you how far people have to travel. So blue is you're within 50 kilometers. So you see it's like centered in the cities and along the border. But anything outside of that, you're traveling, a lot of people are traveling at least 100 kilometers, often far more. And it's just not acceptable. And that's why we need telemedicine with mifegammiso. We've kept this record for many years. ARC has, we track the stance of members of parliament in federal parliament. The majority of Conservative MPs are anti-choice. It's been that way for a long time. So we really have to be suspicious of Aaron O'Toole when he says, I'm pro-choice and we're going to protect abortion access. Yeah, right. And but the other parties are pretty good in terms of you know, policing their ranks, and they're not allowed, like the Liberal MPs are not allowed to vote in favor of anti-choice bills or motions. But since 1987, another thing we've been tracking, 47 anti-choice private member bills or motions have been introduced at federal parliament. None have passed, but one thing that ARC has done since we founded is we fought really hard against all the private member bills and motions that have come up since then and made sure that they were defeated. just wanted to show you kind of a list of the things that the anti-choice movement in Canada are trying to do here in Canada. So there's a group that they want to, I mean, most groups want to just recriminalize abortion totally. If they could have their way, that's what they do. But at least by, like after 12 weeks, right? And criminalize the rest of them. There's been bills introduced trying to give rights to fetuses that are injured or killed during a crime against a pregnant person. They've tried to ban sex selection abortion. That was a bill in the most recent parliament that failed. They want to restrict abortion for genetic reasons. For example, if a fetus has Down syndrome, and they're copying tactics from the US here as well. They've tried to give legal personhood to fetuses by changing the criminal code definition of human being. And they like to restrict in vitro fertilization and research using embryos. This is all on the federal level and the provincial level, and there's a bit of overlap as well here because in Alberta a couple of years ago, there was a bill trying to give full immunity to healthcare workers who have personal religious beliefs, say against abortion, so they would deny care to patients or even refuse to refer them. These bills would, by full immunity, I mean, you wouldn't even be able to complain to the College of Physicians and Surgeons if a physician refused to refer or something. You'd have no recourse at all. They want to pass parental consent laws for abortion. They've tried to do that in Saskatchewan. They'd like to block or repeal the safe access zone laws that protect clinics and abortion facilities in 6 provinces now across Canada. It's great that we have those laws. So far, they're safe. I think they'll be safe. And they'd like to defund abortion, get it delisted as a medically required service. So just to, I mean, this is what they want, but they're not really, in Canada, the anti-choice movement is not that politically influential, in my opinion. They've not been successful really at any of this. So fingers crossed it'll stay that way. Just quickly, I wrote up a pro-choice wish list as well. I don't want to go over my time limit though, but we want better access to abortion outside the major cities and funding for Clinic 554 in New Brunswick. What we might get, we're hoping with the new Liberal government, they promised it. We'll have to make sure that they keep their promises. A national portal with information on abortion on the Health Canada website, and that would help, sort of diffuse all the anti-choice misinformation so that people have a central place to go to. We want to see more like GPs prescribing the abortion pill, beef up the conscientious objection policies of the provincial colleges of physicians and surgeons, because now doctors can pretty much refuse or even not refer, except in Ontario. Regulation of those anti-choice crisis pregnancy centers that Rubina mentioned. They mislead people, tell them lies about abortion, make it sound really bad. We have a big project trying to limit anti-choice advertising, like on buses and things like that. Also banning the display of aborted fetus signs. You've seen that a lot in Toronto, I think. And also the delivery of graphic flyers to homes. So I mentioned before, like Canada is quite different from the US or Texas. Just to explain, well, we have different political systems. We have a parliamentary system up here with multiple parties. We have a charter guarantee of gender equality, and they don't have that in the US. There's no equal rights amendment in the US. And I think that makes a difference. One of the biggest differences, Canada is just more liberal and secular across the board, where the majority of the population is pro-choice. So that makes it really much harder for the anti-choice movement to gain inroads. So even our Conservative Party, which has been traditionally anti-abortion, is always pledging not to restrict abortion. And if they tried, I think they would come up with a lot of opposition from across the board, from other parties, from the media, from obviously groups like ours and the whole movement and women across Canada. And the mainstream media, generally speaking, is pretty pro-choice, and they tend to hold politicians to account if they can sniff in the air that a politician is going to be trying to making comments about abortion. One difference with the US is that the criminal code here is under federal jurisdiction. So that means that provinces can't pass laws to restrict abortion. And they have to be really careful they're not treading on federal jurisdiction. And provinces do control healthcare, of course, so they can pass kind of healthcare related regulations, but it has to be kind of more like, making it easier to get healthcare, or it can't be anything kind of restricting, right? But we always have to remain vigilant. There's always more stuff to do. The anti-choice movement's never ever going to give up. So I've been in this movement, doing this activism for over 30 years, and I'm probably going to be doing it for another 20. So this comes from an article I wrote because when the Texas law came up, and also similar past laws like an Alabama law that also banned abortions after 6 weeks in 2019. People in Canada get really upset and tense and worried, and The same thing could happen here maybe. And so we need to take those fears seriously. But on the other hand, I kind of thought, let's not discount the pro-choice movement and women's rights movement. So yeah, our rights are not safe because right-wing extremists are always going to be fighting to remove them, but we're always going to be fighting hard to keep them. So, right back at you, right? So this is an article I wrote back in 2019 in response to that Alabama law, just responding to some of the hand-wringing out there in the Canadian public, explaining all our victories that we've had over the years and that access has improved a lot since like 1990. And it continues to get better. I mean, there's always more work to do and there's always problems and little fires to put out. But overall, and especially compared on a global scale, we're not doing too badly. And we're certainly doing better than the US. That article is on rabble.ca. So now I just have a few photos and of rallies and marches that we held just last weekend. So as Lisa was talking about, there was like over 650 events across the US. Well, Canada had some events too. And now by strange coincidence, like every October 3rd, it's the first Sunday of every October, the anti-choice movement has their life chain. So they line up outside the clinics and outside hospitals protesting. And there's been several over the years, more and more counter protests have come up against this. So just by coincidence, here we have the October 2nd reproductive justice rallies across the US. And then the very next day in Canada is the counter protest to the life chain. So our sort of brought attention to this and said, hey, anyone wants to organize an event for either day or combine both or whatever you want to do, we'll help publicize and everything. So we put together a list on our Facebook page. So over 15 events were held across Canada in various cities. Some were just devoted to standing in solidarity with Texans, but also talking about access problems here in Canada. And others were lining up on the other side of the street across from the protesters at the hospitals and countering their signs and their rhetoric. So here's the rally I went to in Vancouver on October the 2nd. This was organized actually by Options for Sexual Health. So there was some great signs there. And basically small crowds for most of these rallies. There was about 50 people there, which I thought wasn't bad considering it was a pandemic. We can't get the crowds that the US can, unfortunately. Here's another picture. We marched to the US Embassy afterwards, gave them an earful. This is a picture from Winnipeg. The woman in the middle is Paige Mason. She's she's on our board of directors for ARC. She's our Manitoba rep. So she helped publicize and organize that rally, but it was actually largely organized by women of color. So that was really great. And the thing about Winnipeg, it was also organized by an MLA there. And I think it was the most well-attended rally event in all of Canada. There was over 300 people there. So it was like, wow. And they had a lot of great media coverage. So it was really quite thrilling that they got that many people out. So, I mean, 300, I think for Winnipeg is a lot. I wish we could get 10,000, but I think that, to some degree, there's some apathy in Canada. So it's always hard to get people out, but this was a really great turnout. So we also had handmaids out at some of the events. We had them out at Vancouver as well. There's a group in Canada called Handmaids Local, and there's chapters across Canada and they go by their area code. So Handmaids Local 204 is a Winnipeg area code, and we had Handmaids Local 604 out here in Vancouver. And there's a chapter in Toronto as well. So they're very active on social media, and they could just go out to these events dressed in their handmaid's costume, which is, really resonates well today, considering the restrictions going on. Like Texas is turning into like Gilead or something. It's just unbelievable. Here's another event in Winnipeg, the FAF marching band. I'm not sure what that stands for, but they were countering the anti-choice protesters outside Women's Hospital the next day, the Sunday. So here's some signs, and what they were doing was sponsoring. So anyone could donate to basically you're sponsoring a forced birther, as they call them, to help expand abortion access. So I thought that was a great idea. I donated myself. It was great. Here's a counter protest, again, a Sunday one by a group in Quebec City, a Groupe Monde, des Groupes de Femmes. So what happened was, I think it was a fairly small number of anti-choice protesters, and they just arrived in these huge numbers, overwhelming them. They had loudspeakers and they were just yelling over them. And I think they had a lot of fun. A colleague of mine sent this to me. There was an action where some group, we don't exactly know who, but they've hung these banners over several overpasses in Sherbrooke, Quebec. It says, Mon corps, mon choix, which is my body, my choice. And they were there, they put them up in the evening, late evening. I think they were there up until like at 9 or 10 in the next morning. So I think just in time for rush hour the next day. Here's a protest in St. John's, Newfoundland. Also on October the 3rd, another counter protest. So even in that far-flung outpost like St. John's, Newfoundland, we had protests. And I only had pictures from a few places. There was events also like in Moncton. There was 2 events in London, Ontario, one on October the 2nd, a solidarity rally, and then the counter protest the next day on Sunday. And sorry, not London, Ontario, I meant Ottawa, but there was also an event in London. So just to finish off, what can you do to help preserve access and make sure that the antis don't start winning at any time? Well, it just helps to all these little things you can do. Just talk about it. You can write letters to the editor. You can
30 seconds.
Okay. You can make comments on blogs. You can share your abortion story. Like, don't be ashamed. Speak out. You can organize or participate in pro-choice campaigns and events like we had last weekend. Write your MP, make sure they know your stance, never vote for an anti-choice candidate, just know your rights and the law and the facts, and you can support your local clinics and providers, you can give them donations or just help them out, volunteer, join a pro-choice group, and of course, please, if you can, join ARC, that's our website there, or you can just Google Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada. It's only $30 a year. I think it's a pretty good investment, and because we really work hard to defend our legal rights and try to improve access. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Our next panelist is Robbie Mahood. Robbie was born in Saskatchewan, where he witnessed a battle for Medicare in that province. After studying history and politics at the University of Regina, he went into medicine and was active in the fight for abortion rights, collaborating with pro-choice activists and Dr. Henry Morgentaler in opening and operating his Winnipeg clinic. Robbie is now a semi-retired family physician living in Montreal and a leading member of League for Action Socialists. Welcome, Robbie. Unmute yourself, Robbie.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to all the other panelists. It's been a most interesting series of presentations. I'm going to speak, I'm both as a socialist and also as a physician who was for a time an abortion provider, although it's not the case at present. The 1988 Supreme Court ruling that the existing criminal statute on abortion, which went back to 1969, was indeed unconstitutional, was a significant victory for women, especially women of the working class and oppressed minorities, I would argue. Subsequent attempts to reformulate another restrictive law failed, mainly thanks to the Senate, ironically enough, because there was a very restrictive bill that passed the House of Commons but was voted down by the Senate, who realized that the Supreme Court would not listen to that argument either. The net result is that Canada is rather exceptional among developed capitalist states in having abolished legal restriction to abortion, legal restriction. Of course, what that means is that abortion became really fully medicalized and part of the healthcare system. And of course, that is to say that many problems of access and also of quality of care have been left unresolved. Nevertheless, decriminalization was a defeat for the most retrograde forces in society. The political right wing, mainly grouped in the Conservative Party, and the Roman Catholic and Protestant evangelical churches. These reactionary patriarchal forces have not given up, but they were placed on the defensive and have yet to recover the initiative in marked contrast to the situation south of the border. It's worth noting, I think, the particular convergence of factors, of circumstances and forces that led to this historic victory now some 33 years ago. First of all, the struggle was launched by an exceptional personality, Dr. Henry Morgentaler, a survivor of the Holocaust and a refugee to Canada, who saw the suffering caused by criminalization of abortion and dedicated his life to overturning the law. Secondly, second wave feminism, which had emerged from the radicalization of the 1960s and 70s, provided the leaders and rank and file militants in the pro-choice struggle. Thirdly, the national awakening of the Quebecois, which saw the post-war generation of Quebecers throw off the yoke of the Catholic Church and adopt the most liberal social attitudes in the Canadian state. No longer would Quebec women accept that their lives should be devoted and sacrificed to conceiving, bearing, and rearing children. And that obtains to the present day. To this mix, I think we should add the existence of the NDP, which represents a partial but significant class break in Canadian politics, something which has not occurred in the United States. It's not that the NDP led the struggle. Its leaders were far too frightened of controversy for that, and rather cowardly in the end. But the base of the party were overwhelmingly committed to abortion rights, and they served as a transmission belt for pro-choice attitudes and activism in broader layers of the working population, both in and outside of unions. I would call attention to the historic National Abortion Caravan of 1970, which started in the West, modeled on the On to Ottawa trek of 1935 of unemployed workers. And 35 women chained themselves to the visitors gallery in the House of Commons, and took some time to remove them. So in a nutshell, the right to abortion really was first secured in Quebec. In the wake of successive acquittals by juries and an attempt by the Supreme Court to nevertheless impose a guilty verdict. And in fact, Morgentaler spent a year in prison. But the first PQ government in 1976 declared that the federal criminal law would no longer apply to Quebec. Subsequently, in the mid-1980s, Morgentaler declared his intention to bring the battle to English-speaking Canada. And that was around the time I started my career as a family physician. Henry and his supporters had set their sights on opening a clinic in Winnipeg. Initially, I helped form a group of physicians for reproductive rights. My main contribution came after the 1988 Supreme Court verdict, when I agreed to train and perform abortions in the Winnipeg Morgentaler Clinic. My view of the struggle was therefore substantially through a professional lens, in collaboration with a network of physician abortion providers, nurses, counselors, administrative and volunteer support staff who were involved in running and defending clinics throughout Canada and the United States. This network was greatly reinforced and enriched by our American colleagues, I might say, whose knowledge and experience were more advanced. One felt oneself at that time part of a continental movement that, through sharing of knowledge and experience and a commitment to struggle, had a rendezvous with history. I had the privilege of working with the wonderful staff at the Morgentaler Clinic in Winnipeg and the support of the broader pro-choice movement. Some memories of our local battle in Winnipeg stand out. When it became known that I was providing abortions at the Morgentaler Clinic, the anti-choice zealots descended on our house and mounted daily pickets. I recall that my 5-year-old daughter would weave her small bicycle with training wheels and streamers on the handlebars. I think it was called the Little Princess or something like that. Anyway, she would ride her bicycle around the pickets and also jump on a pogo stick with some of her neighborhood friends. And more than once, she was asked by the picketers why her parents decided to keep her. And also, better, more damagingly, I think, well, it didn't end up damaging her, but could have and that her father was a murderer. They would say this outright to my daughter. My partner, my then partner, Isidore Giuliani, was really truly a marvel and an unappreciated asset for the movement. A veteran of May '68, she brought her class struggle instincts from France, and she jumped to the offensive, denouncing the pickets in front of her house for harassing her family, but not only that, for doing it for such an anti-woman cause with a really ugly patriarchal self-righteousness. One picketer unashamedly told her, "Women who enjoy sex should be made to pay for it." There's a great photo that appeared in the Winnipeg Free Press, and now I have to find this and this. Can you see that photo? Not yet. Here we go. Just a minute. How about now? Okay, so that's
See it, Rob.
You can see it. Okay, good. So this is a portrait of Isidore on the right, with her index finger upheld, berating Pat Soonen, who was a leading right to life leader in Winnipeg. Later, Isidore and Pat Soonen debated the question on CBC radio, and the callers were overwhelmingly pro-choice. That prompted Soonen to withdraw her Catholic pro-lifers from the picket around our house and to send Isidore a letter of apologies. It wasn't backtracking on her anti-choice position, but it was nevertheless a significant concession. And that left only the fanatical evangelicals, who were a scary bunch indeed, I have to say. But at least a wedge had been driven into the anti-choice forces. Now, there was some trepidation in stepping into the spotlight, particularly after the pro-life movement turned violent and began their deadly assault on physician abortion providers and support staff. 2 fellow Canadian abortion providers survived gunshot wounds, and several doctors, I think, I'm not sure if it was 4 or 5, were murdered, were assassinated in the United States. For months after my involvement with the clinic, we would receive mail at the house from pro-life zealots with a content that was always irrational and frequently deranged. Now, Henry Morgentaler was always an inspiration in this respect, engaging in the pro-life camp and those in the middle with calm and rational arguments. He did not seek martyrdom, but he was prepared to accept the risk. So I feel fortunate to have worked with so many others to wrest a significant cession from the capitalist state, the Canadian capitalist state, and strike a blow for women's emancipation. This took the form of a legal victory based on individual rights as defined in the Charter, but it was also a social advance for all women. It could not have been won without struggle in the streets and in and around the clinics against a determined opponent. I mean, the extra parliamentary movement and the movement on the streets did not act in opposition to the lobbying efforts of the Canadian abortion rights organizations, but it was, in other words, it was a complement, but it was a necessary component of the struggle. And that is one of the essential lessons that I draw and we should draw from this period. Of course, it was only a partial advance. Some governments, including the present New Brunswick administration, have refused to fund freestanding abortion clinics. And a couple of the other speakers have alluded to that. The Liberal government invoked the Canada Health Act and did withdraw funding. Well, Trudeau claimed it was millions of dollars, but in fact, more like tens of thousands. But anyway, but he withdrew that. He withdrew that sanction on the New Brunswick government during the pandemic. And as far as I know, it's yet to be reinstituted. So, you know, we have to be, with a guy like Trudeau and the Liberals, you have to be very, very vigilant because they are very slippery. Yes. So a partial advance, but nevertheless a significant advance, the legal victory that was obtained. The question of access has, of course, been a huge problem. especially as I think it was Joyce pointed out, especially in rural and remote regions of the country. But even in urban Canada, access is poor. It's good in the major metropolitan centers, but very poor in smaller cities or even medium-sized cities. Few hospitals provide this service, and those that do, in my opinion, often fail to meet standards of care. There's only one abortion facility, to my knowledge, in Saskatchewan. There may be, the map actually suggested there was one in Saskatchewan, and perhaps there is, but I'm informed that the only one really is in Regina. And in PEI and Newfoundland, there are none. The battle is ongoing in New Brunswick to secure funding for the Fredericton Clinic that should have been granted funding decades ago. In the meantime, and I think it was Joyce that alluded to this, but there has been an advance on the medical or technical front, therapeutic front. The arrival of mifepristone combined with misoprostol, which is the trade name is mifegymiso. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's an important forward step, and it allows women to terminate a pregnancy medically rather than surgically up to, in early pregnancy, up to 10 weeks. So we still need a surgical option, but clearly this changes the ballgame considerably and places a lot more power potentially in the hands of the woman herself who's seeking a pregnancy termination. And but of course, it depends on access to a sympathetic and knowledgeable physician or a nurse practitioner. So despite single payer public Medicare, governments in Canada systematically underfund healthcare and try to privatize as much of it as they can. And reproductive health rights, including abortion provision, are caught up in these machinations to the detriment of women. Well, I'll put my socialist hat on for a moment. To secure more advances for women's emancipation, or even to defend existing gains, we need a fundamental shift in class power at the level of the state. That means, to my mind, a workers' government as a prerequisite for systematic, further democratic and social advance. Fundamental to this task is the notion of political independence. And I think Lisa was also stressed this. Workers and the oppressed must break from all the capitalist parties, the Greens included. The NDP is a horse of a somewhat different shade, but even here we need to recognize that the NDP leadership and their close cousins in the trade union bureaucracy are not reliable friends of women or the working class. Their final loyalty will be to the capitalist state from whence their bread is buttered. And therefore a determined struggle must be waged against these no longer very reformist misleaders. It is essential to build a socialist class struggle left wing in the streets, in the unions, and yes, even in the NDP, without illusions, but with determination nonetheless. So thank you for this opportunity to participate in the panel. I thoroughly enjoyed it and I found it very informative.
Okay, thank you, Robbie. So now I'm going to go to our technical producer, Daniel, to put 3 questions. I think he already asked them in the chat now, but he will also read them. And because of time restraints, I can only give you 3 minutes for the 3 questions. So you can answer 1, 2, or 3. It'll be up to you. And we're going to start off with Joyce, Robbie, Rubina, and Lisa. So that's the lineup. And 3 minutes for each panelist. Daniel?
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, everybody, for all your great questions. We're going to be able to do 3 rounds of 3 questions. Our first question comes from Comrade Ellen, and it goes, could abortion rights be rolled backwards here in Canada like the US? What can we do to prevent this? The second question is, an injury to one is an injury to all. How can anyone be free if women are not free to control their own bodies? What kind of society will we have unless every mother is a willing mother and every child is a wanted child? And the third question, coming from Judy, goes, what was life like for women before abortion was available? What struggles took place to legalize abortion?
Wow, that's a big question. Okay, so we're going to start with Joyce.
Thank you. Well, I'll start with number one. I'm not sure I can address number two very well, but I think for number one, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's always a risk. Like, I think we were all shocked when Donald Trump was elected in 2016 to see how suddenly things can change and you can lose your rights. Now, this Texas law and many other laws in the states, it's like, oh my God, like, yes, our rights can be taken away just like that. And we also know from history that women's rights are usually the first to go. And I mean, we're not close to that in Canada, but we always have to be very, very careful. And my motto was like, never give the anti-choice an inch, because they'll take a mile, they'll just take it as far as they can. And like, for example, I don't want to ever see any anti-abortion restriction passed in Canada, because they can use that as a foundation to build on. And, you know, I think the key here is like, respect for democracy and the rule of law, respect for truth, you know, like we see down the States, the misinformation, the lies, the loss of democratic norms. As soon as that starts to happen, then yes, your rights are in danger. Things can really change. You can end up being sliding towards authoritarianism. So as long as we can retain our democracy and those values, I think we can also maintain our respect for human rights and the legal rights as well.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Robbie?
Sorry, I have to unmute here. Of course, Joyce is right. It doesn't look like they would be rolled back very easily in Canada, looking at the present situation. We had a number of private members' bills under the Harper government that were presented, which were pretty restrictive and well, some of them were actually quite clever and tactically maneuvering to undermine abortion rights. Harper kind of gave them, let them run a little bit with their ideas, but clearly recognized that he was not going to endorse these private bills. And it all depends on the political dynamics and the relationship of forces in the society. I would have to say that Quebec still stands out as a factor of resistance to a general reactionary trend in the social realm, including abortion. But having said that, there's certainly a right-wing populist tendency in Quebec politics now. It doesn't extend to abortion rights or to other issues involving sexuality or morality. So it's more focused on, basically discrimination against particularly minority women. But nothing is carved in stone and nothing is immune. Nothing is safe and secure as long as we have a system that is inherently unstable and leads to people moving en masse to the right instead of to the left. So this is a worry, I think, in the long run, and we need to be armed against it. Well, I couldn't agree more than question number two. What was life like for women before abortion became available? Well, it was possible to get abortions, of course, but very difficult, often very difficult, especially for poor women and women of color. I mean, the rich were always able to secure abortions for their family members or for their mistresses or whatever, but not so in the further down the social and class hierarchy that you went. And so there was a certain, I mean, it was not part of my experience, but the previous generation of physicians would have witnessed quite a few complications of illegal abortions or abortions that were not performed correctly and led to infection and sometimes death. So this was a major public health question in terms of women's health. And so all the more reason to consider the 1988 Supreme Court decision and that whole movement as a major advance forward in safeguarding the health of women, with much more ground to to gain. But, you know, it's a very different world, I think, for women now than it was.
30 seconds.
I do also think that it's difficult to, you know, sometimes when you won a victory like that, it's more difficult to mobilize people in defense of it than it was to mobilize people to gain the victory in the first place. And we suffer from that, particularly in Canada, and even more, I think, a little bit in Quebec. There's a tendency to take for granted. However, I'm very encouraged by the slides you showed, Joyce, and also Lisa in the States. I think that this is something that the current generation of women will not give up on easily.
Thank you, Robbie. Rubina?
So I'm taking question 2, that we will be controlled, women will be controlled by others. They have to depend on others for financially to control their accessibility. And then if they don't have money, if they don't have car, what they need to call others if they don't have that kind of access. And especially Robbie said that women of colors, that very limited access, very limited known people around them. So we will be controlled by others. That's the thing. And definitely injury to one is injury to all. That's really a very nice line. And it will be an effect. And when women from many countries are arriving here to settle down, that will be a big impact on society in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Rubina. Lisa?
Sure. Well, I'll try to touch a little bit on all of the questions. I guess one of my big takeaways from this presentation is just learning from all the other presenters about how different things are in Canada versus the US. And we don't even have like a legal protection for abortion. Roe v. Wade is a Supreme Court decision that sets that legal precedent, but was never codified into law. So we don't even have that to fall back on. And so I think like the struggles in the streets, like that's what, you know, even caused the Supreme Court to make the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, which is what we've been relying on, is women struggling in the street. And that struggle has continued. And I think that, you know, like abortion has always been around, right? Like even ancient societies performed abortions. Like this has always been something that's been normal in a lot of cultures around the world. But now it's like, unless we have that legal protection and we have the clinics and we have women who have access to healthcare who can access those abortions in a safe and legal and affordable way, then that's when women go back to relying on the unsafe practices, like the coat hangers that we saw people bringing to the marches. I don't want to go back to that. So that's why we need those legal protections, but at the same time, we can't rely on those, which is why, because they could be rolled back at any time, which is why we have to, you know, continue the struggle in the streets. And so I think that, like, going kind of back to question number 2, yeah, like women, this is the point, right? Women should have the right to choose. I want to have a child or I don't want to have a child. But there's a flip side to this too, right? Because women who do choose to have children, like I'm a mother, I have 2 children of my own, but then our society doesn't, at least in the US, like I think we're the only developed nation in the world that does not have a paid maternity leave. Women do not have paid maternity leave in the United States. We just got protections a few years ago for breastfeeding and pumping at work. We don't have free access to childcare. Our education system is one of the worst in the world, despite, you know, our status is like the #1 superpower in the US. So it's like we don't want women to have abortions, but then we don't want to support women and their children either. So those are also like really important struggles that we need to continue for women to have support and access and children. if we want children to grow up and be, well-adjusted members of our society, then we need to support those things too.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Okay, so we're going to go back to Daniel now for 3 more questions.
Yeah, so the first question goes, I was struck by Rubina's anecdote that more people were calling the rape crisis line during the pandemic. From what I understand, domestic violence also spiked during the pandemic and lockdown. What fundamentally needs to change for women and gender minorities to be safe? The second question goes, have socialists always supported a woman's right to choose? What about the Russian and Cuban revolutions? And the third question is it true in Canada that even if a doctor is willing and qualified to perform an abortion, it will be impossible if other staff members will not help, for example, the anesthetist?
Okay, so you have 3 minutes again, and we're going to start with Robbie, then Rubina, Lisa, and Joyce. Robbie?
Okay, well, I'll try to answer a couple of points here. Well, there are hospitals, I think, where, sad to say, general anesthetic is still used for therapeutic abortions. I don't know how widespread that is. I'm kind of appalled that that would still be the case, because the lesson from the freestanding clinics, which could equally be applied to abortion units in hospital, is that there's no case to be made for exposing women to the risk of general anesthetic for the most part. So I don't think it would be a big issue, but I do think it's very important to have a dedicated staff, whether in a freestanding clinic, and much more easy to do that in a freestanding clinic, or in a hospital setting, if at all possible, because we want to provide the standard of care that women deserve. And I'm not convinced that hospitals always do that. I don't say it's impossible, but the freestanding clinic model was, I think, a step forward. Now, the mifepristone, misoprostol, I still call them by the old names instead of the combined name. Remind me what it is. Misogynoso. Anyway, it's a bit of a game changer. It places much more power potentially in the hands of women. And I think there is a trend towards direct access of this medication in pharmacies with a prescription. And there's a lot more scope for self-care. And, then that raises the whole question of counseling, where it's a difficult decision, but it may or may not be a difficult decision, but where it is, we need to have counseling available, and basically the whole primary care reforms that we do not have, it's a much more compelling argument to implement them in order to provide people with a much better standard of care. What can I say about socialists? Have always supported women's right to choose. Well, certainly, I was part of, I guess you could call it Trotskyist left in the 60s and 70s, and I still am. And not that people from the Communist Party or the Maoist groups would have opposed the right to choose, but they tended at that time, I think it's probably changed now, but they tended at that time not to see it as a priority because it was a middle class preoccupation. In other words, it wasn't really a truly authentic working class demand. And I think they were wrong about that, and probably they would be willing to admit that now. But it took people who were not of a kind of Stalinist mindset to contribute from the left to that struggle. Of course, it wasn't only socialists. There was a whole broad spectrum of feminist activists who contributed tremendously to the struggle. And the other thing about Russia and Cuba, well,
30 seconds.
I think abortion rights were established in Russia after the revolution and in Cuba after the revolution. So far as I know, there's still access in Cuba. In Russia, under Stalin, there was a retreat in general around reproductive health rights and sexual rights, so that in an attempt to reestablish the family, to privilege the family. It was a very conservative trend. in the 1930s. And then I think abortion was reopened or reaccessed later on after by later leaderships of the Soviet state. So yeah, generally speaking, in Eastern Europe, abortion has been relatively accessible. I can't comment on what standard of care was prevailed, but so that is a legacy of particularly the Russian Revolution and the Cuban Revolution that we want to preserve.
Wrap up, Robbie.
And that's it.
Sorry, it was just that we don't have very much
No,
time,
it's
so
okay.
I'm going to try to keep everybody to the 3 minutes.
No problem.
Rubina.
Yeah.
Rubina.
I'm going for question 1 first, and then I will go to 3 because the question 2 is really nicely covered by Robbie. And so, yes, you are right. Who made the question? It's true that domestic violence is spiked up, and also so does other triggers for many survivors of rape survivors. The trigger flashback. We work for PTSD. That's why we are having heavy call, really loaded. Not only that, mental health issues really suicide rate is now in Toronto 11% higher than before. It's really high. The suicide rate is really higher than any other thing. So whatever we are working, and we are told from ministry for counseling part to continue, not to ignore any survivor, any call, especially one-on-one, face-to-face counseling. Doctors, I have no idea, health professionals, because definitely they're also working. It is a hard time. Pandemic was really hard time. Still it is going on, and all kind of mental health issues, domestic violence, and are really higher than before. So we are working on it. We are trying hard. All of us, the professionals, we are trying hard to make it end. So let's see what will happen. We are crossing our finger. So I'm going to number 3. That's not, for example, it's true. Whatever I heard, I'm not health professionals, but whatever I heard from others, that especially midwives, that this is not abortion is not a very critical procedure. If they change to midwives, they can do it if they're trained well. And maybe they can change their way of work, then it will helpful. Health professionals should think about it, but we don't answer that part. Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Lisa?
All right, well, I'm just going to go for question number 1. Yeah, so I think that, you know, like I'm also a social worker, so I've also seen a lot of the increase in the mental health issues and things that people are so isolated during the pandemic. It's really affected a lot of people in a profound way. But at the same time, these attacks on women, they're happening all the time. Women are being raped, women are being sexually assaulted, women are being traumatized, and not just trans women too, or gender minorities, or people that have different sexual orientation. That's an ingrained part of capitalist society. And I don't think that's why we need to have rape crisis centers. It's really sad because it's such a widespread issue that affects so many people. And I don't think that's ever going to change unless we have that fundamental change to a socialist society. It's essential to have those services to help people and support people that have been, affected by these types of issues. But at the same time, we need to have that societal change. So I just wanted to recommend this book to everybody. I'll try to hold it up so you can see it. So this is by Lisa Vogel and it's called Marxism and the Oppression of Women. And this is a wonderful book. We're actually reading it and discussing it in our women's liberation group right now. And it really goes into the theory behind like why are women being oppressed in society. And it really boils down to the fact that, you know, it's essential women support the social reproduction of labor in the capitalist system. And the family has been ingrained as the kind of societal, the institution that facilitates that. So women, we're reproducing the labor pool by having babies, but we're also, you know, we're providing childcare for free. We're making sure that the workers are ready to go to work the next day. We're taking care of the elderly and the sick. We're supporting that whole labor system. And until that capitalist society changes, that fundamental reason for the oppression of women isn't going to go away until we see that transformation to a socialist society. And then I'm really curious to see like what is the family going to look like, and what is society going to look like when we have that true gender equality. So again, this is the book Marxism and the Oppression of Women by Lisa Vogel. It's a classic. So anyone who's interested in this topic, I would highly recommend this as a good place to start.
Thank you, Lisa. Joyce?
Great, thank you. So much to think about and say here. I'll try and address a little bit all three questions. Question number one reminds me a bit of the other. Question number two is it's such a big question, and you know a lot needs to change fundamentally. And I mean, I'm not a socialist, but I hear what you're saying. I think if people had supports, and like the burden of childcare falls on women, the burden of contraception, the burden of elder care, all these burdens end up falling on women disproportionately, and then that makes it harder for them to occupy the public sphere in a more equal way as men do. So if the more supports were there, financial, all kinds of supports to kind of lift up women and more marginalized groups, that gives them the chance to a better chance to eventually achieve equality. And I'm reminded too of the 1970 abortion caravan when they started out from Vancouver. They had chosen the abortion issue to focus on, but there was this big fight amongst the women about one of the cars, for example, had "smash patriarchy" on the side, and that was a big issue for them as well, right? To get rid of sorry, not patriarchy, smash capitalism. So that was such a big thing as well, and essential to equality, to sort of level the playing field, right? Now. I'm just going to jump to question 3 first, and then come back to the Cuba one, because I have something to say about there. But I think, I mean, when you're talking about abortion clinics and also hospital-based clinics that are like dedicated to reproductive health care, all the staff are pro-choice and supportive. So there's not going to be an issue there. So it's only when you are just going to sort of maybe a regional hospital or a city hospital where you're just sort of there. But I think, I don't know exactly what happens. I would imagine there could be a problem from time to time with some support staff, maybe being anti-choice or objecting. But I also think that a doctor hopefully would be able to surround themselves with the team that they need to do the procedures, especially when it comes to the later term procedures that require more skilled work. But I'm just guessing and hoping for that. And for the question number 2 about socialists supporting women's right to choose, I just was writing about that a while back, and Russia, or sorry, not Russia, well, after the Russian Revolution, I guess, 1920, that was the first time abortion was legalized, I think, pretty freely then by the USSR, I guess. I don't know when it became that name, but the laws became more restrictive in 1939. I'm not sure exactly how. And then maybe I think became looser again in 1959. Although, Russia has always had this reputation for, like the assembly line abortion, not letting women have abortions, but not really, doing a good job of it, so to speak. And I have heard from even today, I mean, I don't know if you consider Russia a socialist country today. It's kind of different from a long time ago, but Russia has an unacceptably high complication rate for abortion. And, like, why is that? So I don't know, but there's maybe it's something to do with the healthcare system in general there. I don't know much about Cuba, except that, yes, they do have abortion on request there. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we're going back to Daniel for the last round of questions.
Thank you, Elizabeth. 2 questions for the last round. The first question is, The solidarity between second wave feminists and young feminists in the US was amazing. Do you think this will continue with generations learning from each other? And the second question, do teenagers require permission from their parents to get an abortion? And I guess you can answer that both from the American and Canadian context.
Okay, so you have 3 minutes again, and we're going to go to Rubina, Lisa, Joyce, and Robbie. Rubina?
So I'm answering the first one. It's really, really catchy. Definitely. It works from person to person. Any kind of wave, it works. It takes time though, but it will. We can actually dream for change, and that dream, this young generation, they are working well, and they will bring a new era. That's what we expect from them, and we have responsibility to be with them in USA, in Canada, all over the world. So for the second one, if it is, are you asking about Canada? Then no, they don't need to even teenagers, doesn't matter, they don't need to get permission from their parents, or even they don't need to let their parents know about their pregnancy, or these are really confidential, and they maintain those things, and health professionals. So thank you. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Lisa?
All right, well, I'll try to answer the second question first. I believe in the US that teenagers do have to get permission from their parents to get an abortion, but I don't know the age limit on that, and I don't know if that's the same across every state. So I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that's the case in the US. And then to answer the first question, yeah, I think the solidarity, I was like super pumped to see so many young women, middle-aged women, kids, older women at the Women's March in the US. And it's really inspiring to me. I have 2 young children. And so I want to teach, I have a boy and a girl. I want to teach both of them to be feminists when they grow up too. And it's really important to pass that along to, continue the struggle. But I think the challenge for the women's movement in the US is about making the movement more inclusive. Because in the past, the women, a lot of women of color or other minorities, maybe trans people or lesbians, or maybe people who have different gender identities or sexual orientations, haven't always felt included in the women's movement in the US. They haven't felt like their demands are being heard or fought for. So I think that's going to be the challenge for the future, is making our women's movement as inclusive as possible.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Joyce?
Thank you. Yes, I second Lisa in the whole idea that we need to be more inclusive in the movement. And for example, like ARC has made efforts to be more trans inclusive, but I think we need to do more work at being more like Indigenous inclusive and things like that, because they have kind of a different experience with reproductive care and rights in Canada. And in terms of the generational gap, I mean, I'm older, but I take pride in the fact that we have a lot of youth membership and engage a lot of youth on our social media. And I'd like to mentor young people. And I think there's a huge amount of energy and enthusiasm and intelligence in the youth community. So it makes me really excited. So I think that there is a lot of connection and solidarity there. I don't see a disconnect between the generations on that issue. At least not on the reproductive rights issue. So that really makes me encouraged for the future. And in terms of in Canada, teens or minors do not require parental consent for abortion. In Canada, we go by the mature minor doctrine. So it's kind of like the doctor would maybe decide with with the patient, whether they're mature enough to make that decision and discuss it with them. So like more care will be taken, more counseling, but at the end of the day, the minor will get to make the decision as long as they're capable, and the parent can't overrule that. I think it's a little bit different in Quebec. There might be like a chronological age thing, and Robbie might know more about that. But yeah, it's good because as I said before, the anti-choice movement is trying to get parental consent laws passed in Canada. So, and they've been unsuccessful. It probably would be, it would go against any, the medical ethics and directives that are currently in place in Canada for the mature minor and so forth. So hopefully it'll stay that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Robbie?
Yeah, well, I can only echo most of what has been said already. Of course, just looking at those photos that Lisa and Joyce presented, I was really pleased to see the particular photo of the demonstration in Winnipeg. It brought back a lot of memories. But if I look at that photo, there were women of several generations there, and there were women of color, at least on a couple of the big demonstrations in the States, were pretty prominent in the mobilization. So I really think it's that the women's movement will not stay down for long. If there are problems, women will come together, and the strength of the feminist movement has been there in the past, it will be there in the future, and I place a lot of hope and confidence that women are ready for whatever struggles are coming. I do, yes. Well, you're quite right about teenagers in Canada. I can't really comment on the States. It's a question of whether informed consent has been satisfied, but provided that it has, then confidentiality prevails. You don't have to tell the parents, and I think that applies in Quebec as well. I'd be very surprised if it didn't. So that's the way we proceed with, say, even a 13 or 14-year-old presenting with an abortion request. That's the way it would be. I mean, a little more care is taken. Maybe there would be a higher likelihood of some counseling input, but not with the idea of dissuading or of denying the rights of the young adolescent to care. That's all I have to say.
All righty. Okay, so special thanks to Lisa, Rubina, Joyce, and Robbie, and of course to Daniel, who is our technical producer here in Toronto. So please consider being a supporter of the Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online. To fill out the form, just visit our website at socialistaction.ca. That's www.socialistaction.ca. And while you're there, maybe you can take a look at our book, which is Women's Liberation Today, Our Bodies, Our Minds, Our Powers. And this was a participant's remark in our Women's Day presentations that was made in 2021. Socialist Action women here and others were telling their stories. So if you'd like to have a copy of that, Women's Liberation Today, you can also find it at www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to Socialist Action Canada at gmail.com or just call us 647-986-1917. Once again, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next SA website will be on Thursday. That's next Thursday, October the 14th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on the topic, Canada's Foreign Policy in Ruins. China, Israel, Haiti, and Venezuela, featuring Eve Engler of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and other speakers to be announced. In the meantime, please be safe, stay healthy, stay active. Bye for now.
Joyce, before you leave, can you put up in the chat